Hello and welcome to another Loughborough conversation hosted by the Institute for Advanced Studies. My name is Sabina Mihelj. I'm Professor of Media and Cultural Analysis here at Loughborough University. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Janet Wasko, who is Knight Chair in Communication Research at the University of Oregon in the United States. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you.
Janet, I should say, is also one of the world's foremost authorities in the field of political economy of communication, and she is also currently serving as the president of the International Association for Media and Communication Research, which is one of the largest as well as one of the most diverse, or the most diverse, professional association in the field of communication and media research. Janet, let me start by asking you a couple of questions about a line of your work that is probably best known, certainly most cited and influential, and that is your work on the Disney Corporation. Now, we all know that Disney characters, Disney stories have been attracting audiences, both young and old, for several decades, in fact, since the 1930s. What, in your view, is the secret of this enduring success of Disney? Is there something about the quality of the stories that they tell? Is there something about the quality of the animation? Or are there other forces at play?
This is a really big question. It's an important question, and I don't know if there's one definite answer. I think there's several things. It's complex, as a lot of questions are that pertain to the success of companies and the success of media. Some would say, well, it's the quality and the creative part of the company, and they're innovative and so forth. Yes, they are, but also I believe they've been able to, over the years, maintain their popularity because they're very appealing to young people, to children, and they grow up and then they have their own children and introduce them to Disney and so forth. So part of it, I think, is that ongoing generational component. And it's also associated with family, and which is special, almost sacred. Family, and then also those wonderful qualities that we're told it's all about, magic, fun, fantasy, and so forth. So the company also is very good at promoting itself as family-oriented, magical, fantastical, and so forth. So those things coming together, I think, are important. It doesn't just happen that it's so popular. There's a lot of promotion by the company.
You mentioned promotion. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? That was quite an interesting part of your talk yesterday, the various tours, the merchandise that Disney produces to promote its films. And I have to say, I have two small daughters who, as you might imagine, are enthralled by Disney products. And over the years, we've been reluctantly to several Disney-themed parties, among other things, let alone all the products that we bought. So could you perhaps say a bit more about these various strategies? I'm sure you are very familiar with them.
I think actually parents know quite a bit too, like you. But it's, again, it's very, very deliberate, the promotion. And I think to start with, which I did in the talk yesterday, it's important to recognize the Disney company's use of synergy, which is not just producing a film, but producing the merchandise and promoting it at the theme parks and across their company. And they do this very, very deliberately. In fact, there are people at the Disney company who are in charge of synergy. They just don't produce a film or another product, but they promote it across all of their divisions, and it's very, very deliberate. So we bump into Disney. We bump into, for instance, let's take Frozen, the film. It's one thing to go see the film, but then we keep seeing it, we keep hearing it. the music and so forth. And so it's that I think is an important promotional device, you know. But then also the promotion is typical of corporations' advertising and promotion. They promote their new products and so forth. But also there's something that they do regularly, which is celebrate different anniversaries. And they go back to the 30s, they go back to Walt Disney's birthday and celebrate everything. And so every year something is being celebrated. The opening of Disneyland, Mickey Mouse's 50th birthday or whatever. So those kinds of things are promoted. They also are really good with working, for instance, with the theme parks. I think I mentioned as well. And they don't just leave it to the travel agents to learn about Disney. They actually have courses that they have the travel agents go through, and they earn their ears and their mouse ears, and they become authorized Disney travel agents. So obviously then they promote it and so forth. Sometimes these include trips to the park or one of the parks, the theme parks. So that's very deliberate as well. There's also the other typical kinds of things that that other Hollywood companies do to promote their products, which is touring the actors and actresses associated with the films, but also in this case, Mickey and Minnie tour around, and lots of events in different places associated with their new products. So that's just a few of the ways. I mean, it's endless, actually.
Yeah. I was wondering, how big a part of the revenue then do these additional activities and the merchandise constitute, as opposed to the actual box office revenue from the films for Disney?
Actually, the division that brings in typically the most amount of money is are their networks, their entertainment networks, films and television, and of course they own ESPN, which has been very, very lucrative, at least until recently, and it still is. And that's very international. And then the theme parks also, of course, and now there's six resort areas with lots of parks within that. And then the merchandise and consumer products, and that includes these days a lot of digital products and digital activities. So typically it's the broadcasting cable that bring in the most. Yeah, but then there'll be a very successful film, and now they have some very, very, very big franchises like Star Wars. On a year that they release a Star Wars film, of course, the films will bring in, you know, the most amount of money. So all of them contribute.
Yeah. Well, as part of your talk, you were talking also about aspects of Disney that are perhaps a little bit less magical, shall we put it. What particularly, you know, stayed in my mind was you know, some of the aspects of the labor conditions at Disney. You might perhaps, well, some of our students, in fact, ended working for Disney, thinking back over the years. But you mentioned that actually Disney, at least in the US perhaps, is not the most favored employer. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that as well?
Well, actually they do attract a lot of young people especially, but people who would love to work at Disneyland, Disney World, whatever. I'll have to admit that I worked at Disney for a while, but at the studio, after working at a few other places in Hollywood, for a very short period, doing nothing very important, just to qualify that. And it's very appealing, it's very alluring. You grow up loving Disney and you think, oh my goodness, to work for Disney would be fantastic. But the wages are typically relatively lower than you would think, especially at the theme parks. And then especially at the theme parks, there's the conditions that make it sometimes not as much fun. to work there as people think when they first start. A lot of restrictions on employees. When they're greeting people, guests at the theme parks, they have to be very, 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 very attentive and so forth. They have to be, you know, as any retail situation, but there are very, very strict rules about how you look and how you act. And then there are the characters that wear the costumes, and they're even more restricted. They have to be in character all the time. They can never ever take the heads off. They're fired immediately if they do. And these are in places that are quite warm, hot even. And there are stories about the characters collapsing around the park, and they have this little cart that runs around and picks them up and takes them away. But I mean, that's really pretty severe. It's a place where sometimes people don't last a long time because, and then when they leave, they'll write books about their experiences. So this is how we find out about these things. Yeah. So it varies according to, I think, the division of the company, but especially at the theme parks, there's those stories.
Now, I would love actually to continue our conversation about at Disney. There is much more there to explore, but let us now broaden our view a little bit onto the context within which Disney operates, and that is the Hollywood industry. To what extent would you say that the features that you described about the Disney Corporation, to what extent are they symptomatic of the workings of Hollywood as a whole?
Disney is in some ways similar to these other large corporations which have dominated, you know, Hollywood for many years. In fact, Disney started out very small in the 30s and was not really a major player until, well, they went into television in the 50s, but then maybe the 80s they became a real strong major studio. And they're similar in that, you know, they're corporations and they're diversified, and the other majors try to do synergy, of course. They have diversified holdings, they're into television, music, and so forth, and merchandise. But Disney really, in some ways, does it best, if we want to think of it in a positive way. They're quite successful at that kind of diversification and synergy. But the other ones do that as well. They don't just depend on their films. So in that way they're similar. Of course they're similar in that they're organized for profit and they have all of those objectives and goals. And they compete, but then again they also work as an oligopoly. They work together sometimes to maintain copyright and maintain other kinds of favorable conditions. So I think the thing about Hollywood these days is the challenges that they're facing in, first of all, the whole digitization that's going on, new outlets for films and entertainment. They're challenged by other large companies that are coming out of the digital environment to start making films and so forth. For instance, Netflix, Google, Amazon, I think those are the ones especially that are moving into producing films. And so it's kind of a challenge from outside, right? But these are still very, very large corporations. And beyond that, just the challenge of a lot of diverse attractions that are offered by the internet, by social media and so forth. It's very much alive and doing okay, but there are these, as usual, various components, forces, things that are going on that they're adapting to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you mentioned one key challenge for Hollywood, which is digitalization. But there have been over the years also challenges coming from other parts of the world, so to speak. So the film industry is obviously globally much more diverse than it used to be perhaps in the 60s, 70s, 80s. We have players such as, well, Bollywood historically, Nollywood and others. Now, to what extent would you say that these players managed to challenge or perhaps even displace the dominance of Hollywood?
Yeah. That's an interesting topic because Hollywood has really dominated world box offices for quite a while. And probably in the 20s, Hollywood films were around the world and really very popular. They became more and more popular, and actually, again, after World War II, reinforced that kind of dominance because other countries where films were made, of course, suffered from those wars, and the US didn't. They were there producing films and were able to supply films after those wars. And then they had also established a worldwide distribution system very early on, to which actually films from other countries rely on because of that very extensive distribution system. They've also taken advantage of different situations. There's a whole saga of how Britain has tried to deal with Hollywood, taxing and blockades and so forth. And you know, well, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but still, even with all of these challenges, and especially you mentioned Bollywood, Nollywood, and so forth, Hollywood films still maintain a dominance in international box offices. Well, you know, for how long, I don't know, I can't predict, but they're still very popular, and they come out with these huge films that are promoted, as we noted, that other film industries actually have a hard time doing. And there's always also that the Hollywood style, the Hollywood model, and whether we like it or not, it's there and it attracts people, and they pour a lot of money into those films. So they're not going away. They're facing some challenges, and we'll see if they can maintain that dominance. It's been shaken a bit, and there's a lot of talk of, you know, what the future looks like, and especially those challenges from those new companies. The configuration of the majors in Hollywood seems as though in the future might change, and especially now Disney is threatening to take over Fox, so there'll be one fewer major studio. So it's going to be even more concentrated.
It's a fast-moving field,
yeah.
And from what you're saying, obviously it's very important that people with your kind of expertise and from your kind of perspective, which is political economy of communication, continue working on these issues. And if I might perhaps now shift to this broader question of political economy, the field has obviously a long history, and you were one of the key players almost from the beginning. You could argue. Well, not
quite, but
yeah,
I was there. I've been there for a while.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, what attracted you to start with to political economy of communication as an approach?
I mean, it does go back through. Well, we can go way back to the classical political economists. But to talk about political economy of media and communication, you know, since the 40s and 50s, it became pretty strong in I would say in the 70s and 80s. My attraction, I suppose, was just the very basic importance of political economy, just to be asking those very important questions of who owns the media, and what is their aim, and who benefits, and those kind of basic questions I think need to be continuously discussed. It is important to talk about the content, the texts, the audiences, and the changes and shifts, of course, but still to look at, you know, the structure of these industries and so forth. I think it is, for me, it's a place to start. It doesn't mean that it answers all of the questions, and we have these continuing debates about all of that. What's the most important thing to study? Well, we need to study the whole thing. I've been interested in a version of what they call systems approaches now these days, and looking at the whole and lots of different factors that influence situations. And so I think we need to do that in media and communication, and not just look at the end product or just audiences, but who really is controlling the media. Yes, there's a lot of possibilities these days for anyone to access a lot of different kinds of media, to make media, of course, and those are we have to acknowledge those developments. But those very large companies are still around and still relatively strong, I would say, and to understand that, I think, is important. So that's what really started my interest, and then it just kept reinforcing itself. So.
Yeah. How about looking now at some of the more recent developments in the field of communication and media that are somehow perhaps related to political economy approaches? What I have in mind is the growing body of work on cultural industries, as well as what is often called media production studies. Yes. Now, to what extent do you see this as a continuation, perhaps in some ways, of the political economy approach? Or, one question that comes to me repeatedly is the extent to which the notion of cultural industries, the way it's being used now in the field, has managed to retain that critical edge that it had when the notion was first formulated by Horkheimer and Adorno. So I was wondering what your view is on these particular developments.
Well, I think you one point you identified just now is that critical edge. It's one of the problems I have with some of the versions of approaches that look at culture industries, media industries, is the lack of a critical edge. I mean, of course, the culture industries are not just an academic notion, but being picked up by governments and so forth and supported. But I think one of the points that I like to reinforce is that background, the history of political economy specifically looking at these issues, and from often a critical position. And I think some of the new approaches aren't so new, but also there's a kind of misrepresentation of political economy. I have a problem with that. But there are very similar questions asked, and I think that sometimes the difference is it doesn't have that critical edge. I mean, typically I think if you say political economy and media or communication, you kind of imply a critical approach. There are different approaches to political economy. But the newer approaches, the cultural industries, media industry studies, as you say, media production studies, that's great, but sometimes, not always, sometimes it's missing that kind of critique. So that's my only problem. Certainly early on when, for instance, I would attend cinema conferences and there was no interest in talking about the industry or economics or political economy. And now there's more of that, there's much more. So we have to say that's a good thing. But it's that kind of critical component that sometimes is missing.
Thinking about your current role as the president of the IMCR has been one of the, should we say, institutional contexts within which political economy as an approach has really thrived and achieved its influence internationally over time. first of all, well, those of us who have perhaps done a bit of, administrative work in the area, we know how big a task leading an organization such as IMCR is. So what actually led you to accept this role to start with, and what perhaps do you want to achieve with it?
Oh, I guess I should say once upon a time. When I was a graduate student, I attended the IMCR for the first time, and it was meeting in Leicester, by the way. And I found it to be, first of all, very, very stimulating, very international, very welcoming in a way. People who, scholars was reading their work, there they were, and very open to discussions and so forth. And I continued attending over the years. And actually IMCR hasn't been as popular or known in the US, but increasingly, it's getting a little better. But so I continued to participate, and then also the political economy section was formed, and I found that to be really, really helpful with my work, and also then helpful to encourage younger scholars as I grew into that role. And I just find the organization to be really important, especially in its real international scope, and that kind of welcoming kind of spirit. It's also, compared to some of the other professional organizations, mostly based in the US, it doesn't have a kind of intense networking, getting a job, making connections, and so forth. It's more of a community. I may be romanticizing things a bit, but I think you talk to other people and they would probably agree. As far as serving as president, it's been a challenge, but one that's been really good in terms of being able to make a difference in strengthening the organization and introducing some new ideas and so forth, and working with two now different executive boards, and has been very important. It's not just me. We really do work together to keep things going. So, and our connections also with international organizations, especially with UNESCO and UNICEF and so forth, also make it very valuable. Sometimes those relationships are fraught with issues, but it's still, it's still a very good connection. We've been able to work with UNESCO on putting together something called the Global Alliance for Media and Gender, and now play a very key role in that alliance. So that's something that really is international, and it's been growing over the last few years. So yeah, and then also I have to admit, you make friends when you see people over the years, and I think part of working for and with IMCR is that continuing friendship. And of course the work, specifically I think political economy has grown quite a bit within IMCR, and so I'm very pleased to see that. So
perhaps one last question, because we have been talking for quite a while now, I think. You mentioned the relationship between IMCR and UNESCO, among other things. This leads me to, or reminds me of, the long history of IMCR and its political influence on the shaping of communication industries worldwide, especially during the 70s and the early 80s, the time of debates about the new world information order. Now, what is the potential for IMCR to have such an influence today, or was that, a particular moment? And if I may perhaps ask a broader question, what can critically minded communication and media scholars today do to influence communication policies and the real world development of communication industries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are really good questions, and would take a while to actually explore. But you're right about during the 70s and the New World Information Order and so forth. It was a moment, and it wasn't just IMCR. There were quite a few members who were involved, and a lot. It was a closer relationship, I think, at the time with UNESCO. But it really was, and I think also it wasn't just UNESCO. It was a period of time where there were different political, it was a little different political climate, I think. And I don't know if there was success, actually. At least now, the kind of discussions at UNESCO and the UN and so forth I think are quite different. There's less opportunity to get a critical position. It's really tough. And this is why at least some of the things that are going on, like the Global Alliance for Media and Gender, that's been relatively successful. So there are themes that you can pursue, but it's not the kind of moment like it was in the 70s with really very, very critical, strong arguments for major change. What can we do? It's a question that I think we're constantly asking ourselves. I think I'll quote my colleague Vinnie Wasko by saying that we work as knowledge workers in our roles at universities and in our academic scholarship and research. But also I think many critically oriented academics are also involved in other kinds of organizations, issues, struggles, and so forth. So it's not just our work at university and teaching and so forth, but also our praxis outside of that work. What difference we make? Well, I'm not sure. I think we open some students' eyes to issues and complications that pertain to media, and I think we just have to do that and work for some positive changes as well. So I wish I had better answers for that question. I think it's an important one.
Thank you very much, Janet, for the conversation.
Thank you.